Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We are going to continue on with this week's theme of whatever, where I allowed my Patreons to pick anything without any restriction as a way to celebrate 5 years of the channel. Today we have Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith, Existence in The Unfurling. This was described as one of the most unique and richly lush sonic recordings I've come across. Realities are created and transmuted throughout. And, yeah, that sounds real interesting. So, let's dive into this. We have 11 minutes of music ahead of us. Let's see what Kaitlyn is bringing to the table today. It's interesting given how wide that vocal harmony is that it's kind of tucked into the mix. Putting all of that distortion on the ooze. It's interesting to hear how the harmonic widener is interpreting her whispers as she kind of gets down into very airy sounds. So at this point I'm snagged. My interest is piqued, but where are we going with all of this? It's interesting to hear all of this movement alongside that drone going on in the background. Also, it's neat to find that some of this evolutionist change, it's not part of the composition, it's the way that the production interprets these sounds. The subtle movements, I'd even say the clashing of sound waves. You know what this reminds me of, though? It's abstract art, the musical. It's just panning left and right, but it sounds like it's going around me. That's neat. Also, a lot of this feels like rain to me. I don't know if anyone else gets that as well. It's also interesting that despite almost the chaotic nature of this and also the heavy repetition in the drone, ooh, this is getting spicy. Despite all of that though, it's still very clearly in 4/4. It still has that core pulse in there. As much as I was talking about that rhythmic pulse being there, it's getting obscured. It's becoming more and more difficult to find that groove in this track. Okay, that was neat. This is one that I don't think I'm going to be able to speak about too much in detail about specific things that are happening. It's a song that I think is more about the larger perspective, and even within that, that's most of what I took in. The details, the technicalities of what's happening, it's all a little beyond my scope, as one, there's just so much stuff going on, it's difficult to listen to individual ideas, but two, a lot of this comes at me from a production standpoint, and I lack the skills and knowledge and information to really dive into that and explain how this is being created the same way that I typically approach classical or pop or rock or metal. This one's just a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but I can still appreciate it nonetheless. I do want to start at the beginning though. Well, no. Let's start with the atmosphere. I'm already changing my mind on how things should go. This is really interesting because the first band that comes to mind for me listening to this, or artist, not a band, is Autechre. Now, granted, I've only been exposed to a handful of songs of theirs. Maybe I've only been thrown into the deep end, but Autechre to me is it's an artist for electronic fans, maybe even more so electronic musicians. But I think more importantly, they're also a band for people who like to count. It's a metric nerd group. A lot of the songs that I've checked out from them are metrically interesting with rhythms and polyrhythms and polymeters and all sorts of different ways of composing percussive sounds. This is that same idea, but replace percussion and rhythm with texture and atmosphere and harmony. This takes the concept of harmony and pushes it to its most extreme limits, the same way that Autechre pushes rhythm to its limits. What ends up coming out the other side is something that is incredibly dense, very atmospheric, but also quite avant-garde and experimental in a lot of ways. It's difficult for me to get this, though I do understand the technical skill involved and just how complex this is. I was trying to think about what I would even say while I was listening to this, and that's where I landed. It puts me in a very similar mindset to Autechre, where I get it, and maybe I can talk about some of the technical components to it, but I don't even know where to begin understanding it because it pushes a single concept to the edge. And I thought that was pretty interesting because this is very distinct and different from Autechre. In a lot of ways, there's no reason for these two artists to ever be in the same sentence, and yet I see a very similar approach to composition between the two of them. So what do I mean when I say we take harmony and push it to its limits? Harmony is just stacking multiple notes on top of each other. It's the interactivity between two or more pitches. That's really all that harmony is at the root of things. This song is smashing so many notes together simultaneously. Some of it is perceived harmony. There is a lot of really fast movement, even in an individual instrument. There are synths in here that are just constantly pushing forward with eighths or sixteenth notes, however fast you feel the tempo of this song. But it is that constant that quick movement that's going on pretty much at all times after we get into the meat of this song. After we get out of that 3 minute or so intro, that was primarily a bit more rhythmic and focused on the harmonies of the vocals. But as soon as the vocals left and we had that massive instrumental slow burn, this quick movement existed throughout a lot of that. The 4 to 8 notes that an instrument might play with some of these runs forms a harmony within itself. It actually kind of tells us a lot about the key, the mode that we're in, and even the chord that we're presently looking at. I'll get more into that later. That actually gets a bit more complex. But if you take all the notes that are being played, and instead of playing them in order, you play them simultaneously, you now have a chord, or maybe even a full key. It'll tell you exactly what the harmony is, even though we aren't technically harmonizing these notes at any given time. But beyond this single form of harmonic illusion, we also have true harmony, because we have other instruments playing these constant 16th notes on top of this one instrument, and they're all creating dyads and triads and chords with this first note, with this first instrument, with all the other instruments. It creates something that is exceptionally dense. Beyond that, we also have a droning sound in the background that provides some sort of root tone almost to the entire concept. And then we also have pitched percussion. We had that, well, to me it sounded like some sort of, what are those things called? Is it a hand drum? I usually use that term to talk about like bongos, any sort of, particularly a wooden drum head that you use your hands to play. It is a drum you play with your hand, thus a hand drum. But I think more technically a hand drum is like a steel pan. And you can hit different parts of the drum to get different pitches out of it. And I think that's what's being used here. Regardless, we have this pitched percussion sound. It has a metallic element to it, and it's dancing around this panning back and forth that also feels three-dimensional, circling around me. Different pitch on every hit. We're not getting the constant 16th notes out of it, but we are getting these, I believe they were quarter note hits, creating another pitch to add to this massive stack we're already having. This just constantly happens. There's so many different sounds and instruments that are coming in, just stacking up all of these notes so high. The harmony ends up becoming quite complex. In fact, to the point that the song's over now, and at no point in the song did I understand what kind of chord we were in. I still don't really have a strong understanding of the emotion of the track, at least not in the ways that I typically relate to chordal ideas. Instead, it just feels chaotic, hyper complex. There are parts in it that I felt were vast. Other parts I felt were a bit more exploratory. Some that I felt reined things in and looked more into like an introspective angle. There were parts in here that felt a bit more somber to me, and others that felt energetic and driving, and sometimes these ideas were mixed and matched. Something vast but introspective. To how do you do that? the best way I could imagine it is that half of whatever stack of notes we have is representing one idea, and the other half is representing an opposition, and they're coming together to form this opposing idea in the emotional resonance of the atmosphere. And there should be clash in that. We only have 13 notes or 12 notes to choose from. And if you're only going to choose 6 or 7 of them for your chord, and someone's going to play a different chord, you're going to run into half-step differences. One chord might use an F, one might use an F sharp. Well, if you also have a G thrown in there, you have the F, F sharp, G. That's 2 half steps combined. Those notes are going to create tension and dissonance. It's too close, too nearby to have any positive harmony come out of that. Those sound waves are just going to clash and create noise. That's what dissonance is. It's clashing sound waves. How do they get around that? That's a question I've been asking myself this whole time. If the harmony is so dense and they're using basically as far as I can see, is compound chords, how is this still so beautiful? I think it's because of the movement. I mentioned that there's a lot of warbliness to notes. Part of that I do think is in a production element, a phasing component. Maybe there's some panning, like very slight panning going on. Maybe there's volume fluctuation where they're coming in and out. Maybe it's some other, I don't know, effect or filter I'm unfamiliar with. But there's also pitch modulation in here, almost as if many of these sounds have a vibrato on them. This makes things blurry. One of the nice things about vibrato is that it's not perfect. In fact, it's the idea of using imperfection to drive unique elements to a note being held out. Because if you just sing a note, you're either flat or you're sharp. You're above the pitch you're aiming for or below it. Or you're spot on, which is almost impossible, especially for humans. Even if you're just like a cent or two off, you're technically flat or sharp. Instruments typically tend to be perfect, but even they need tuning. Strings get slack, tuning nuts get loose. There's all sorts of ways for a pitch to change over time. Digital, electronic sounds are pretty much the only ones that could be perfect. And so I find it really interesting then, in this case, that we have all of these digital instruments, and yet we're using this element of beautified imperfection. The idea of the vibrato is that you don't need to be perfect anymore because you're constantly going a little sharper and a little flatter. And so you don't need to have that perfection. You're actually using the imperfection of the instrument in a way to create beauty, movement in the melody itself. Here we just have vibrato everywhere, even in non-melodic ideas. I talk about that drone in the background. That's technically not accurate because that drone, which implies a single tone, actually has a lot of movement, both production-based and pitch-based to it, which I guess in this case is through the production, but I'm not really used to talking about electronic instruments. Vibrato is something that is naturally done in my mind. It's not something you put in post, but I guess in this case it probably was. Regardless, there's a lot of movement even to the drone. And so we never really have to worry about being in tune with things because all of our notes are constantly in flux. It almost makes things a little bit blurry, as if you're seeing 2 microtonal notes out of every note being played. This microtonality allows any sort of dissonance to sort of be disguised, as the notes are going to constantly be fluctuating between being in tune with one pair of notes, maybe one chord, and then being in tune with a different group of notes. And so they're constantly always in tune as long as you are hearing the right context to that note. And that context is always going to be here. And so instead of having notes fluctuating in and out of being in tune and slightly sharp or flat, because that's what a vibrato is, we now have notes that are fluctuating between tonality. Are they part of this chord or are they part of this chord? That's the fluctuation now. Most songs aren't written polyharmonically. Vibrato takes on a very different direction when you start writing like that. It's what makes this so interesting to me. It's what makes this stand out. It's the big wild, like nothing else in this song really blows my mind. At least not from my typical perspective. There's some really cool production stuff in here. I'd love to understand it, but I don't get it. It's magic as far as I'm concerned. But the science behind the composition of why this harmonically works is jaw-dropping. And the fact that it's kept up for as long as it is shows that it isn't just a mistake. It isn't just, oh, I threw a bunch of notes together and it happened to work out. No, there is intentionality to this. There's a strong concept of, or a strong grasp of harmonic theory. It's kind of bewildering to me that this constant change of the atmosphere to sort of morph into all of these different emotions and dual emotions and complex atmospheres, while seemingly chaotic to me, probably had a very deft hand controlling the ways that it evolved. A strong knowledge of where to take things and how to manipulate them to get there. And that's just, it's mind blowing to have that kind of knowledge and understanding, not just of what to do, but how to do it. And I think that's, I mean, that's just, like I said, that's the big thing right there. I don't even know how to follow up from that. Nothing else is as intense, I think, as the harmony. I did like the vocal stuff at the beginning. I actually have an effects plugin that does something similar. You just sing and it puts in the harmonies around it. Maybe she did it by hand. Actually, I don't. I assume that. Oh, snap. Well, there we go. I'm going to get back onto that in a second. It says Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith is a classically trained American composer, performer, and producer. Yeah, there you go. This is not by mistake at all. She's got these chops. She's classically trained composer and producer, and I think it's really interesting where those two overlap. Usually they don't. And the few times that I have seen electronic music being used in more traditional, possibly classical composition, it's always sort of an afterthought. It's an extra component. It doesn't really work well with sheet music. We're kind of making up notation as we go. But when you find that point where you can mix those two passions and bring those two skill sets together, that's where you find Kaitlyn. And she's just tearing it up in this. I've never heard anything like this. I honestly haven't. Um, and having one person with both of these skill sets, that's that feels like it's the only way you're going to wind up here. Other than, like, the classic a bunch of monkeys in a room will eventually type Shakespeare kind of idea where you just luck yourself into something like this. But uh, again, I'm flabbergasted by what's going on here. That makes a lot of sense, though. Going back onto what I was saying about the vocals, like I said, maybe she does hand touch all of the vocal stuff, but there's plenty of plugins out there that will automatically add these formant shifted well, actually just harmonies around anything you run through it. And I think that's what's going on here. It definitely sounds very robotic. It sounds very digital. It does not sound like somebody who went and retracked themselves half a dozen times in order to get these very rich harmonies. But what I think is most interesting about it is that she doesn't use a full-bodied vocal style the entire time. She kind of gets down to these airy, whispery tones, not really bringing the volume down like I did, but just adding in a lot of breathiness to it, usually to start off a sentence or a phrase or to wrap it up, a way to sort of lead into a melody line or to fade out from it. And I think it's really interesting how the effect ends up interpreting that the way that the breathiness gets form and shifted too, because well, the program doesn't know it's breath, it's just sound, right? So we got to down tune it. And I thought that was really interesting. I think my biggest complaint about this track might be just how long the intro goes on. It's an interesting idea, and I enjoyed it for the first minute and a half. It definitely builds intensity. No, builds intrigue. I wanted to know what was going on. It feels like we're growing towards something. It just takes a really long time to get to that something. I kind of wish that the pacing might have been just a little better at the beginning, but it was well worth going through that for the next 7 minutes of sound. And I suppose that wraps it up for this. I'm gonna check out some lyrics in a second, but I don't know how to describe this. Like I had mentioned, the person who requested it said that they view it as realities being created and transmuted throughout. I can kind of see that. The constant growth and evolution of sounds. I think that's a fine reading of this. I don't really have one. Like I said, I was just jaw dropped on the floor as I began to understand how the harmonies were coming together. But I don't really have a big connection or some sort of story or through line to what all this might mean. I did allow parts of it to sort of wash over me, but for the most part, this captured me technically more so than emotionally, and I would not mind going through it again to kind of see where my mind took me on a more narrative level. But honestly, I think even a second listen, I'd be hard stuck on the harmonic evolution here and the dual and even triple harmonies at times, and how the note fluctuations can work within that realm, sort of like I don't know. There's got to be some sort of science where things can exist in two places at one time, and that's what this feels like. It's that scientific idea put into musical concepts, which obviously creates something very avant-garde and esoteric. All right, let me see what was being sung at the beginning, and then we're gonna wrap this one up. Now, the beginning almost feels like someone thinking about what dying would be like. Or I guess another interpretation of might be what they want their experience of death to be. It says, when I go, I'll see that wonderment. And it's the last thing that I want to know. For it is the sole intent to be, passing on what makes one go calmly. When the dark come, get moving to the beat. Move so fast till you can't see beyond your feet. Ooh, this sounds like fun. Now, this idea of going could mean anything, honestly, but the idea of says when I go. So it's not something that's planned, but it also says that it's the last thing I want to know, which to me feels like, this is how I want things to be. When I'm on my deathbed, I want to see the wonderment of life, what it was to exist and be as a human, and then to go, to pass on calmly. And it says, when the dark comes, which I think is interesting, assuming that this is what I think it is. We usually talk about going towards the light. That's the common idiom about dying, but I like the idea of when the dark comes. To me, that feels more natural. It's the brain shutting off, the body turning off for one last time, the eternal sleep. I don't see light when I'm sleeping, it's just dark. So when dark comes, get moving to the beat, move so fast you can't see beyond your feet, which I think is interesting too. To move so fast you can't see beyond your feet. My idea would be that you're moving so fast that you do see beyond your feet. So you're so far ahead of your transportation mode. But this is sort of an inverse of that, almost something that feels backwards. And maybe that makes sense when we're talking about death and going towards the next state of existence. But here's where things get thrown a little out of loop. I'm not sure if I'm reading this correctly because this last stanza doesn't really fit any of that interpretation. It says, use your words. I like the sound that come out when you don't. That gets interrupted. There's a hyphen there. And then we repeat the phrase, use your words. I don't know if those are supposed to be interpreted together. I like the sounds that come out when you don't use your words, or if I'm supposed to see them as two separate sentences. That the idea of that second line was cut off, and that the third line isn't an extension of it. Regardless, none of this seems to fit with my concept of wanting to view the wonderment, what it is to be and exist, and have that flash before your eyes as you pass on to the next realm. It is interesting, though. It's a little bit of figurative language here. I've kind of had to take my own interpretation of it and apply that to the stanzas themselves, but I think you could easily read these lyrics in a different perspective and come away with a very different conclusion on what it's about. And what I'm saying is I think the lyrics are interpretive, and well, I mean, obviously the music is as well, and through that lens, I think they fit each other really well. Even I think my perspective of it, wanting to see the wonderment as the last thing that I know, this music is really an encapsulation of a lot of stuff. It is not one individual idea, it is existence, it is the wonderment of life, it is so many different emotions and colors and feelings and events all smashed together and viewed non-linearly. That's how I feel this song is, and it pairs very well with this concept that I'm getting out of the lyrics, at least. But as I said, it all feels very interpretive. Someone else could find a completely different read on both the lyrics and the music that also feels rather synergistic. And well, I'm kind of curious if anyone else has a different read on this. These are my thoughts. Kaitlyn Aurelia Smith's Existence in the Unfurling. What did you think of this? Is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that you would like to add on to what I said, or maybe correct me on? Do you have your own interpretation of this song, your own opinion of it? Put all of that stuff down in the comments section, as well as any other thoughts you'd like to share. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree. Takes you here. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. Alright, that wraps it up for today. I'll be back tomorrow, though, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 10 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening whenever you choose to watch my videos.